Ami Bera and Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy for joining us today to speak about the CARES Act and the next congressional effort to provide support during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you to the many association professionals who are out there today who joined us to learn more about the effort to include 501c6 trade and professional societies to the Paycheck Protection Program. The Congressman and the Congresswoman have been longtime supporters of the association community, and we are all grateful for their support, and we're very appreciative of their participation in our town hall today. As all of us know, associations are facing unprecedented losses from meeting and event cancellations and certain future losses from declining membership and other revenues. At the same time, associations play an integral economic and societal role in our country by providing professionals with resources, education, and career development, creating industry standards and operating certification and accreditation programs, promoting safety, health, and environmental protection, and engaging communities in the public interest, among many other critical roles that we play. I would like to thank Congressman Bera and Congresswoman Murphy for their attention to these issues. Since March, ASAE has led a charge to include 501c6 associations in the Paycheck Protection Program. And now to talk a little bit more about that effort, Mary Kay Cunningham, our Vice President of Public Policy, will give you an update on ASAE's work in this area. Mary Kay?
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you to Congressman Bera and Congressman Murphy. I've seen the inside of your living rooms from cable news, and now we've got it on ASAE Zoom. So thanks for joining us. We're very thankful for Congress for all you've done to work to help Americans during this time. We're glad that 501c3 organizations were included in the Paycheck Protection Program. After the Senate draft of the CARES Act excluded many associations, ASAE led a grassroots effort to add associations to the emergency aid. And thanks to all the ASAE members who answered that call. We had over 10,000 messages go to the Hill that week. We also delivered a sign-on letter to ask Congress to add 501c6 associations to the Paycheck Protection Program. That letter now has over 4,000 signatories from across the country, and our goal has been to share stories with Congress about how associations have been impacted, and also the good work that we're doing in the communities and that associations are doing around the country. We're glad to hear the latest from the Hill, from Congressman Bera and Congressman Murphy. I'm going to hand the floor to a longtime public policy advocate, Jeff Tenenbaum. Jeff is one of our nation's leading nonprofit attorneys and also an accomplished author, lecturer, and commentator on nonprofit legal issues. He's the managing partner of the Washington, D.C.-based Tenenbaum Law Group, and in this role, he counsels his clients on a broad array of legal issues affecting trade and professional associations, charities, and other nonprofits. For over 19 years, Jeff practiced at the Venable Law Firm and chaired the nonprofit legal practice for most of that time. And he's the author of the ASAE published book, Association Tax Compliance Guide, a real page turner, and serves on the ASAE Legal Advisory and Public Policy Committees. Jeff.
Thanks for the ringing endorsement of my book, Mary Kay. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you like Ami on the West Coast. And if you were wondering which one is the real Ami Bera or the real Jeff Tenenbaum, the screen has my name on both of us. Little technical glitch there, but hopefully we will be able to get that fixed. But if not, Ami's the good-looking one below me. Let me take a few minutes. First off, I want to thank Congresswomen and Congressmen for joining us today in this really important program. I've been spending day in and day out for the last month, 6 weeks or so now, helping many different associations deal with so many different fallouts from the coronavirus, from their cancellation and potential cancellation of meetings and events to economic assistance available to them under the CARES Act. And it's the latter that's going to be the focus of today's program, and specifically probably the kind of feature program of the CARES Act, which is the Paycheck Protection Program. A program that's run through the Small Business Administration, typically a federal agency that only provides assistance to small businesses, as the name would suggest. In fact, become extremely familiar with the kind of underlying statute that governs the Small Business Administration. And even in the statute and the requirements itself, nonprofits are generally not eligible for any assistance. So this is a new thing, generally speaking, in terms of any nonprofits being eligible for assistance through the CARES Act and through the Paycheck Protection Program specifically. As many of you know, there are multiple different economic assistance programs that were written into law in the CARES Act. One of them is the Paycheck Protection Program, a program that is available on the nonprofit side only to 501c3 organizations, but your typical charities, schools, nonprofit healthcare institutions, religious institutions are eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program, but other nonprofit organizations, other tax-exempt entities like 501c6 trade and professional associations are not eligible to participate. That's the focus of today's program. There are some other programs, frankly, much less economically valuable to the nonprofit community. Some other loan programs and whatnot that are available, like the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Certainly helpful nonetheless, and a number of associations are contemplating or have taken advantage by applying for loans under that program. But it's really the Paycheck Protection Program, a really interesting, dynamic, not perfect, but really terrific program that we want to discuss today, how and whether and perhaps through what vehicles that could be expanded to include trade and professional associations. We're very fortunate to have two special guests with us from the Hill who are very much in the middle of this, and the timing is we're literally right in the heart of the discussions that are going on right now in terms of what might happen with a potential expansion and additional funding of the Paycheck Protection Program, which the Trump administration is pushing hard for, an extra $250 billion in funding. That has led to a lot of discussions and debates on the Hill with the Democrat side about what the Democrats would like to see in addition to that extra funding for the Paycheck Protection Program. And that hopefully is going to provide an opportunity and a vehicle to reevaluate some of these issues, such as the exclusion of associations from that program. So by way of introduction, let me introduce our panelists here today. First, Representative Stephanie Murphy represents Florida's 7th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. The district includes all of Seminole County and much of northern Orange County, including downtown Orlando. She currently serves in the House Ways and Means Committee, where she's a member of the Subcommittee on Trade and the Subcommittee on Worker and Family Support. Previously, the Congresswoman was a businesswoman and college instructor after serving as a national security specialist for the U.S. Secretary of Defense, where she received numerous awards for her distinguished service, including the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service. She worked on a wide range of security issues, from counterterrorism to foreign military relations to strategic planning for the department. And prior to her public service, she was a strategy consultant at Deloitte Consulting. She holds an MS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a BA in Economics from the College of William & Mary. She lives in Winter Park, Florida, with her husband and 2 young children. Congressman Bera represents California's 7th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. His district is located just east of California's capital city, Sacramento, and lies in Sacramento County. A first-generation American of Indian descent and born and raised in California, prior to being elected to Congress in 2012, Ami was a medical doctor for 20 years. Among the highlights of his medical career, he served as Chief Medical Officer for Sacramento County and as Associate Dean for Admissions and Outreach at the University of California, Davis. I'm sure many of you have seen Ami on television speaking to the medical and health-related issues of the coronavirus and speaking quite well and informatively about them. In Congress, Ami's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Non-Proliferation. He's also vice chair of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. In addition, he's a leadership member of the New Democrat Coalition and was a former co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Problem Solvers Caucus. He holds an he holds a BS and an MD from the University of California, Irvine, and he's lived in Elk Grove, California for over 20 years with his wife, Janine, who is also a medical doctor. They are proud parents of their daughter, Sidra. So with those introductions, let me turn it over to Congresswoman Murphy first to get us started. And Congresswoman, if you could just give us, knowing what we're here to talk about here today, give us insights, thoughts, maybe an update on where things stand. I'm sure everyone is very interested to hear kind of where the state of discussions are with respect to potential expansion and or modifications of the Paycheck Protection Program and anything else that's relevant to this discussion.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for the kind introduction, and Susan and everybody at ASAE for inviting me to participate. And of course, I'm happy to be here virtually with my colleague, Ami, as well. I know, let me just first say that I know how incredibly challenging these times have been for everyone. But I think what we have to recognize is that COVID-19 is first and foremost a public health crisis that has spawned a sudden and pretty profound economic crisis as people take the necessary actions to stem the public health crisis. It's caused a lot of businesses to shutter, conferences to be canceled, meetings to be canceled. And of course, representing Orlando, I have seen and felt that pretty directly, as Orlando is a key destination for those conventions. And I imagine many people on this call have probably been to Orlando. But as you know, we have tried to address this issue in Congress from the public health perspective, and then also on the economic perspective. Before I talk a little bit about the economic perspective, which is, I think, the piece that you're interested in, I'll say that it's pretty remarkable that within 3 weeks, roughly within a month, we passed 3 major bipartisan pieces of legislation to try to address this crisis. A lot of the legislation was focused at trying to address the public health threat that COVID-19 is, and that was money to provide testing, resources to ramp up R&D into testing, therapeutics, and vaccines, and other medical equipment necessary in this time. And, I think it's a recognition, all of those investments into the health elements of this is a recognition that that's pretty much the only way this crisis ends, is, us being able to get in front of the public health crisis. As it relates to CARES, which we just passed, there were a number of pieces of legislation or provisions in there that was intended to help us be able to provide people the support they needed to make good decisions from a public health perspective, not go out, stay home from work if they're sick. So we had sick leave and paid family medical leave to kind of address that piece. And then we were able to get in there some provisions that address the economic harm that is happening. You mentioned PPP. We have seen in its implementation that turns out in the middle of a crisis, starting a brand new program is not exactly probably the best approach. And so that program has had a lot of problems in its implementation. We want to make sure that we get it right before we put more money into it. And right now, the way that it is being implemented, it's not necessarily helping everybody that it was intended to. The 501c6 issue is clearly an example of that. I just got off a call with my local chamber, and they are doing everything they can to keep their doors open because their members need them more now than they ever did before. And they don't have the same lifelines that are available there. One provision that was in the CARES Act that I do want to highlight was the employee retention tax credit. For me, that was a provision that I worked really hard to get into the Senate bill. That wasn't originally in the Senate bill when the 2 bills came forward. It basically provides a fully refundable tax credit that employers of any size can claim. The credit is equal to about 50% of qualified wages paid to an employee, up to a total of $10,000 in qualified wages per employee. My original provision was far more generous than that and reflects the actual wages of an American worker as opposed to what it got scaled down to. But I think that is an approach to achieving the goal that I think the P3, the SBA PPP program intended. These programs were intended to keep workers tethered to their employee, to their jobs. And I think there's value in keeping workers tethered to their jobs because of the benefits that come with the job. Healthcare benefits, it keeps people off the unemployment rolls, which is, as we watch unemployment tick up here in Florida, we're recognizing that's really problematic because some states' unemployment systems are not functioning correctly. And so our best option should have been to keep workers tethered to their jobs, irrespective of the size of that job. Because if I'm a worker, I don't really care if my job is a job with an SBA certified small business or a medium-sized business or a large business. All I know is I have a job, and that job helps me put food on the table for my families. And so we made a lot of distinctions, I think, in trying to get to this goal that were unnecessary. And ERTC, if I'm going to be focused on making sure that it gets expanded in any future bills, because it is, to me, the most direct way to get federal dollars to the employee, which is through their employer, through a system that already exists, through the payroll tax system. You don't have to set up a new entity. You don't have to bring in third parties like lenders or banks to implement the program, which is the problem with the PPP program. And you're not taking a haircut on the federal resources because you're not having to pay the bank fees. This is a direct from the federal government to the employees through their employers, helping employers with their cash flow at a critically important time. So that is just sort of my bias. And I would say, your associations have been doing a great job reaching out on the Hill. The issue of the 501c6 is well known. What I would say, as you advocate for additional assistance in these future bills, know the member. I sit on Ways and Means, so my primary committee's tools are unemployment and taxes. Those are my jurisdiction. I get so much feedback on the PPP program, but my senior senator here in this state is the one that devised it, right? So, and he's the Small Business Committee chair. And so he should be hearing this feedback from folks, as well as the Small Business Committee over on the House side. The state of play of the bills is that I think the Senate wanted to do just more money to the P3 program. And it's hard to say that you're being responsible with taxpayer dollars to throw more money at a program that has received such uneven marks without making the necessary fixes to it. And moreover, while small businesses are fighting for their lives, our hospitals are literally fighting for Americans' lives, and they're begging us for more resources. And our state and local government, who run the emergency programs and emergency management for all of our communities, they're begging for resources. So it seemed a little tone deaf, I think, from the House perspective, for us to move forward with just more money to a small business program that isn't functioning the way that it was intended anyways, without also providing a lifeline to American people through our frontline healthcare providers and through our state and local governments. And so I think that's where we are right now, is in the negotiation. And in this moment, we need bipartisanship. And bipartisanship doesn't mean you send me a bill and you force me to vote on it. It means you talk to me during the process and we craft a bill together that works for both chambers and both parties. And I think that approach has been missing. Hopefully that will be the approach that, we move forward with, because the American people are waiting on us. So with that, I guess I yield to Ami for other thoughts, but happy to take questions in the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. And I do have some follow-up questions for you, but why don't we wait until Ami gets a chance to give us his thoughts, and then we can go from there. And Ami, one thing, if you could comment on that we have some folks asking about on the Q&A section, and that I know everyone's curious about, is why, to the extent you feel comfortable talking about it, and obviously you're on the House side, not the Senate side, and these decisions were made on the Senate side, but why were 501c6 associations not included in the Paycheck Protection Program? And there's, there was a lot of talk about how they were included, all tax-exempt entities in an early draft, and then by the end they were kind of dropped out. And any insights you're comfortable sharing in that, or that you're aware of, would be helpful. So turn the floor over to you.
Sure. Well, thanks for that, Jeff, and it's good to see Stephanie virtually as well. Stephanie's been a leader of the Blue Dog Coalition, but also with the Problem Solvers, and really is a person who works across the aisle, and something that we both share, that particularly at a time like this, we've got to take the politics and set that aside and really go to work for the American people. I wasn't in the room, from a Democratic perspective on the 501c6s, as well as other nonprofits. We really did want to get that in there, and I think there was a real push from Democrats to get it in the original CARES Act. Something happened on the Senate side, and again, I'm not exactly sure why the Senate Republicans took the approach that they did in terms of not allowing it to make it into the final bill. I know we're trying to rectify that because we all have, whether you're a large association or we all have our chambers and other groups here locally that are going to be critical in recovery. We're looking at our local chambers right now as kind of train the trainers, because we know our SBA is overwhelmed, and if we can work with these associations to get the information out, to get information to their members, we're going to need all of that. So it's vitally important to keep associations afloat right now, but in the recovery, it is going to be equally important to keep those associations intact, because we don't know what recovery looks like. So I think that's part of the reason why we're fighting hard to get the 501c6s in there, as well as change some of, in the original CARES, all nonprofits were treated as though they were small businesses, and in truth, nonprofits are not small businesses in that traditional sense. They depend on philanthropy, they depend on grants, et cetera. And they become a vital tool in our local communities as well. So as we come out of this, we also think we need to think about nonprofits differently as well. So I hope we rectify the 501c6 component, because we do think member organizations are going to be vitally important as we come out of what recovery looks like. I'm not going to repeat what Stephanie said, other than associate myself with what she stated. I'm going to put my doctor hat on for a quick second, and because I think it's important for your members and all of us to kind of get a sense of what does recovery look like, and how are we going to think about that, because that's going to be vitally important in getting information out. So if I think about how we ended up here in a nationwide shutdown, stay-at-home order, it really was the fact that we didn't ramp up our testing capabilities. There were plenty of folks sounding the alarm that this virus likely was circulating in our communities. And unfortunately, we can go into what happened with testing capabilities, but the fact that we didn't have countrywide or ability to do diagnostic tests to see who had the virus and then do contact tracing left us with only one strategy, which was to essentially have everyone stay at home to slow the spread of the virus. Now's the time that we're starting to have the conversations in Congress and with the administration on what does it look like once we get past the public health crisis. And what that really looks like is, first and foremost, as Stephanie said, we've got to slow the spread of the virus. And in California, we do think that the curve is flattening. We haven't seen the surge that you're seeing in New York, but we're not out of the woods yet. And as we start to see the number of hospital admissions go down, the number of ICU admissions go down, that's going to be the most important metric that we follow. And if you listen to Tony Fauci, who I know well, on his press conferences, he'll hone in on those two numbers. And those are the key numbers to look at: hospital admissions, ICU admissions. The number of deaths is a lagging indicator. That's a look back to where we were 2 weeks ago. And that number may continue to go up. The number of new cases certainly will continue to go up as we ramp up testing capabilities. But when we see the hospital admissions start to come down, that's when we can start to think about, okay, what does coming out of this look like? You can't lift the stay-at-home orders until you have enough diagnostic testing capability that's out there, because we know this virus is with us until we have a vaccine, and that likely won't happen until 2021. So we know as we start to resume whatever the new normal is, you will continue to see clusters of cases pop up. And you'll have to go quickly diagnose that case. Is this COVID-19? Yes. And then you'll have to do the contact tracing to say who else might have been exposed, test all of those individuals, and shut down clusters and communities. You'll also likely have stay-at-home orders for anyone who is showing symptoms of fever, cough, etc. And then you'll hear us talk about a different test, a serologic test, an antibody test. What that tells us is who actually got exposed to this virus, got the virus, recovered, and now has a level of immunity to that virus. You know, in the animal studies, you know, we think that immunity lasts at least months, perhaps longer than that. Those folks are at no risk of getting reinfected. We haven't seen reinfections. We haven't seen that this virus is mutated. That doesn't mean that can't happen, but thus far, looking at Asia, looking at other places, and our own experience here, that hasn't happened. That group likely will start going back into the community. And then you'll have a group of folks that, let's say 55 and under, that are relatively at low risk. They're not at no risk, but they're at less risk of getting really sick, getting hospitalized, getting intubated, and dying. You are seeing some mortality in that group, but that group probably will also return. I'm not going to make any predictions as to when we start lifting stay-at-home orders, but I do think there'll be immense social, political, and economic pressure to start doing so in probably early May. It'll probably happen regionally. And in the interim, we're going to have to start building up that testing capability, the public health workforce to allow us to manage COVID-19 at the national level. And the reason why I'm spending a lot of time talking about this is I think it matters to the people that you represent, as well as the economic case, because we also know this isn't just a public health crisis. The sooner we can safely open up and restart our economy, the less damage we're going to do to our economy. So there is some pressure to get this right. We also can't get it wrong, because if we have to shut down again, we will definitely be going into a depression. And I don't think our economy could survive that. Let me just close with this, and then we'll take questions. I think if I were sitting at the association level, I would be thinking about what is that new normal going to look like, because we probably have social distancing with us until we have a vaccine. We may have it forever. You know, what is that going to do to the industries that you represent? We're having that conversation within our restaurant business. You know, these are low margin businesses, and if all of a sudden you're taking out a quarter of the tables to create distancing, that's going to change the model. What is that going to look like in the convention and tourism industry? What is that going to look like in theaters and sporting events? So those are questions that we have to be thinking about right now and working through. And what do those business models look like as we come out of this? So they're taking place, and you know, I think this is where associations partnering with Congress and your local leadership can be really helpful in sharing your ideas and thoughts, because you know, we do want to keep our country and economy afloat. So I'll stop with that, Jeff.
Thank you, Amy. All right, let's start getting into the questions here for the second half hour of our town hall. We have a lot of questions that have come in on the Q&A feature. There are a lot of stories, and Mary Kate and Reggie, we should try to figure out a way to kind of capture all this and pass it on to the congressman and congresswoman's offices, because there's a lot of really specific, detailed stories about kind of the impact of the virus on, particularly the economic impact on so many different associations, that I think it's important for you to know. Now, that being said, it sounds like from both of your comments, you're both very much supportive of the idea of expanding the PPP to include 501c6 associations, perhaps to make other changes to it as well. We've certainly all read about other, some of them are kind of structural defects in the program. You know, the issue, for instance, of having to spend the money within the first 8 weeks on payroll when sometimes you can't do it because like governments are, for instance, state and local governments, at least shutting down meetings and conventions. So you can't necessarily pay your people to go to events that are legally prohibited from shutting down. Obviously, the same thing goes for restaurants and things like that. And so there are certainly some structural questions about potential changes that should be made to the PPP, as well as expansion, of course, of who's eligible. Have you had these substantive discussions started yet from your vantage point, or is it more at a higher level right now in terms of, are we going to require any sort of changes in exchange for additional funding for the PPP? This is to either one.
Stephanie, do you want to take it?
Go ahead, Ami.
Okay. I think they're happening at kind of the leadership level right now. At the committee level, we're certainly pushing our ideas out there through our chairs to the speaker and Senator Schumer on our side. I think there is a recognition that that the original $350 billion likely will get used up potentially by the end of this week. So there's some urgency. But Stephanie said, it would be a shame if we didn't take this opportunity, because it's gonna require a vote to fix some of the things that we know didn't work, and to address things like the 501c6 issue, as well as other issues, community banks, et cetera. So I would urge the folks that are negotiating this not to play politics. Take the opportunity. It's hard to, as you saw with the last CARES package, I don't think it's a great idea for everyone to fly back to Washington, D.C. to vote on this. So if there's going to be a single vote to pass this, let's do as much as we can to rectify and correct some of the things.
Got it. Anything to add, Congresswoman?
No, I think we have heard that the P3 money will run out this week, and they're gonna. I'm hearing that they're gonna probably try to pass it by UC, but my hope is that we will have made some adjustments. Although we're also hearing rumblings now that a certain member from Kentucky might create some issues around you seeing a package of that size again. So we may, even though Ami is right, we may see a redux of CARES.
Yeah. Yeah, and for those of you who don't know what UC means unanimous consent, and that's kind of the process that's been used to pass some of the recent legislation when the members of the House at least have been out of session. But as its name suggests, it requires unanimous consent of the whole chamber. Just so you guys know, we've heard this a lot. We have heard that the original kind of narrowing of nonprofit eligibility for the Paycheck Protection Program was, like a lot of things on the Hill, very political. And a concern about organizations that are primarily engaged in lobbying political campaign activity, like some 501c4 organizations, regardless of what side of the aisle they might be on, or 501c6 organizations that we've heard there was a perception that these are primarily lobbying organizations and therefore they shouldn't be funded. One thing that you guys should be aware and to be able to share with your colleagues as well is that for all SBA programs, loan programs and otherwise, there is a prohibition on any monies going to any organization that is primarily engaged in political or lobbying activities. So even if there was an expansion, to 501c6 associations, for instance, there really are extremely few 501c6 associations that primarily, which the IRS generally defines as more than 50% of your time and your money being spent on political or lobbying activities. That's not the norm for what associations generally do. And if there are some out there, and there probably are, they would not be eligible anyway. So this is not a question about expanding the PPP for lobbying organizations. And as ASAE and I and others can tell you, it's an important role that most associations play at the federal, state, and local levels, but it's by far not the only role, and it's not the principal role for most associations.
And Jeff, we've got some research from the ASAE operations ratio report that is 501c6 orgs dedicate a mean of 5.19% of their resources to lobbying. So a really small amount, and to your point.
Yeah. You know, we've also heard from, you know, some folks that, well, yeah, C6s can't qualify for the PPP, but you have the EIDL program, you know, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. You know, certainly the payroll tax credit that Stephanie helped to push through is a very important and very beneficial program. It doesn't provide kind of cash in hand to kind of keep employees on the payroll, but it does provide significant economic impact. But there are so many associations who are very much kind of wanting and craving the PPP. It's a much, much more beneficial program in so many respects than the EIDL loan program. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but the EIDL loan program also has a requirement that we've heard from a lot of our clients, that for any loans over $200,000, there are personal guarantees required in order to get the loans. And that's just, in the nonprofit world, that's just not something that's going to happen. And so that makes it, you know, for any kind of medium to larger size association, that's going to make it, you know, almost a non-starter. You know, other than, you know, of course, the fact that the loan is forgivable if you spend, you know, spend it on certain types of expenses, primarily payroll, 75% of it. The interest rate is 1% compared to 2.75% for the EIDL loans. You can defer payments for 6 months. There's so many more benefits from the PPP. It's a critically important program. Mary Kay, why don't I stop hogging the microphone and turn it over to you for questions that you may have for Congressman or Congresswoman.
Sure. Well, I wanted to share one of the stories from the folks that have written in on the Q&A, and the ASA Public Policy team will share all of these as we do our outreach to Congress. But Mark Golden shared that COVID closure has put an immediate halt to critical engineering certification testing across the country. So this has not only crippled public safety, their mission of ensuring engineers and making decisions affecting public health and safety, but also reduce revenue by 40%. So there are a lot of examples in the Q&A about the impact on the ground, impacting health and safety and all types of folks.
Yeah, and we've also heard from these comments today that, and we know this, I mean, I spend 3/4 of every day these days counseling associations about what to do in connection with their upcoming in-person meetings and events that they're likely not going to be able to hold, and all of the significant cancellation liabilities and everything that go along with that. But the practical reality of all that is these are hugely important factors in revenue generation. You know, for associations, you know, it's generally not donations. A lot of associations have related foundations and they get donations, they get grants. Associations, you know, get membership dues, but they get education registration fees, trade show registration fees, sponsorships, all of these things from these big meetings and events. Stephanie knows well, she's got one of the biggest convention centers in the country in her district, and associations go through there all of the time. These generate huge amounts of revenues that support all of the staff of these associations. That's why so many associations are having to lay off so many people, furlough people or whatnot as a result. It's a really critical time, and you're right. You know, when you guys were talking about your local chambers of commerce, you know, they're in the same boat as associations. And as you know, they're all in the same tax category, 501c6, and they're all really, really, really hurting. And we're obviously very happy to hear that both of you are very supportive of that sort of a change.
Yeah, and I'll answer a quick question from the Q&A about C4 or other 501cs. So ASAE and we're advocating for 2 programs that would help all 501cs. That is, first, we've asked Congress for emergency aid relief for associations. That's a $25 billion ask. And then the creation of a pandemic risk insurance program that would go to prospective events. So it wouldn't have to, if this was passed and you have to reschedule for late summer or fall, then that could cover you. That's something that we've seen bipartisan support for, especially in the House. But those are the 2 asks, ASAE ones that would support all 501cs. And the reason that we shifted our focus to 501c6 organizations in the Paycheck Protection Program was because of the feedback we got from Congress and legislators that this was the most viable limited expansion that could be supported. So that's some feedback for how ASAE moved to that. And we are also always looking for examples from other 501c organizations to help show Congress the impact of COVID-19 on the whole association sector.
Yeah. So Congressman, Congresswoman, you know, hearing all these different thoughts, these concerns, you know, if you were going to make, you know, an argument to your colleagues, you know, whether it's Senate Republicans or whoever might be on the other side of these issues, and not to say that all Senate Republicans or all Republicans are opposed to 501c6s being included. We know that's not the case, and you guys are both known for your bipartisanship, and we're kind of counting on you to help bridge some of those gaps, as you guys have both done many times. You know, we want to make sure that you have kind of the ammunition, you know, the understanding of not only the harm that C6s are suffering right now, economic harm, because of what's going on. I mean, there's no question about that, and I think, and we'll give you additional kind of stories and details to be able to help support that. You know, but look, this was a political decision in the first place to exclude them, and it's going to be a political decision to include them. It's really not an economic decision. I mean, the fiscal impact of including associations in the PPP is got to be negligible, because it's such a tiny, you know, the size of the association community compared to the nonprofit 501c community is just a tiny fraction. So the fiscal impact on the budget is not going to be an issue. That's not going to be a driving consideration here. And to tell us, is there anything else you need to understand, you know, to help best advocate for that position?
So I'll go and start it, Stephanie, and then pass it off to you. No, not from the intellectual component of it. Thinking through the politics of it, I would hope that every member, Democrat or Republican, is hearing from their local chambers, local associations that were left out, the 501c6s that you know, we all have our personal relationships back home. And I think if they're not mobilizing and reaching out to their members of Congress right now, they really ought to be. And I'm going to guess that if they're hearing as much as I'm hearing from our local 501c6s, they probably have some real political incentive to try to get this fixed. I mean, the arguments I would make are the ones I made earlier, that, you know, I see the organizations that you represent as issue advocacy groups that are, so if I just think about myself as a doctor, I can go raise issues as an internist and say, as one internist, and say, hey, here's things that we ought to be fixing and thinking about, et cetera. But if my association that represents thousands of internists are able to collate that, they're going to have a greater ability to share what we're going through. And I think that's why issue advocacy groups, associations are going to be really important as we come out of this, because we don't know what this looks like. And you know, in many ways, the members that you represent are the eyes and ears on the ground of what's working, what's not working, and it's going to take all of us working together. But you know, just on the political side, I think the major players are important, but I think right now all of us are looking at our local communities and trying to get our communities through this. And if they haven't mobilized, they really ought to be mobilizing with every member of Congress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add to what Ami said is, you know, the federal government should be helping as many people for as long as we need to. And so we shouldn't differentiate too much between firms based on their tax structure. Everyone is hurting through no fault of their own. You know, they're all victims of this public health crisis and our response to it. Workers are workers are workers. Doesn't matter who they work for or what the tax status of that entity that they work for. We should be creating programs that and writing, making our programs inclusive as much as possible of the broadest spectrum of workers in this country. And so it shouldn't matter if you work for a 501c6 or whether you work for Disney or you work for a small business. A job is a job is a job.
Yeah, no, you're right about that, and we're here seeing a lot of questions, comments, about what about 501c4s. First off, as you know, not all 501c4s are primarily engaged in lobbying or political campaign activity. In fact, this tax code restrictions on the political activity side and being able to not spend more than 50% on that. But regardless, like you just said, Stephanie, they're all employers, they're all hurting, and there is an argument for putting the same language that's in for the EIDL loan program to apply that for the PPP program. And ASAE is in no way opposed to that. It's just that ASAE and its advocacy, has decided, because that's what it was hearing from the Hill, that might be an easier lift. So that's what they've approached from an advocacy perspective. But that does not mean they're in any way opposed to a broader expansion of.
Absolutely. We want the greatest amount of help for the greatest number of our members.
Yeah, Stephanie, I do have a question for you. There's, and this may be something that you did not propose in your original, push for the employee retention payroll tax credit, or maybe you did. I frankly don't know. But as you know, there's a provision in there that says if you received a PPP loan, you're not eligible to get that tax credit. And there are some people who are even asking here in the questions, well, if we take advantage of that payroll tax credit now, which we would like to, does that mean we're going to be ineligible for a PPP loan if there's an expansion to this? Is that something that you've thought about or planning to try to address?
We need to fix that. And it was not a part of my original bill. I think what they wanted to prevent was double dipping, but I think what we need to be looking at is providing people a layered cake of different options on how to get through this crisis. The reality is the P3 loan is for 8 weeks. These people will have damage that is beyond the 8 weeks. So I think, and in my letter to leadership pressing for changes for the ERTC, I have identified this as one of those things. So if they didn't make it either or, and you could do both, you could cover down from the period of time when injury occurred starting in February through to whenever your loan got dispersed, use PPP for the 8 weeks of your loan, and then pick up ERTC on the other side of that. And you can make yourself whole. Because the reality is your loan, the 8 weeks starts when your loan gets dispersed. And so that locks people into a very narrow and inflexible period of time for when they can use that. When, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, some of these folks aren't going to be back online yet to have workers on payroll or have workers back, because they're not operational yet. They can't be operational yet. So I think we need to be creating the greatest level of flexibility. Of course, if you're taking, PPP for the 8 weeks, then maybe you don't get the ERTC during those 8 weeks, but certainly on either side of it, there could be value for that. So it's part of what we're advocating for as far as changes going forward. And the other thing I will say, and this is a big part of why I think we need to make changes to the P3 program and to get ERTC more expansive and right, is that if we don't get these things right, we're going to have even more unemployment claims. And that's all coming out of federal dollars too. And so, and also unemployment claims, I just believe fastest, least friction between federal government and employee. And with unemployment claims, you have to go through a state entity, a state government. And in Florida, our state government is failing the folks who are filing for unemployment claims. So instead of spending all this money building unemployment systems that can handle all of the claims, let's just get to a place where people don't have to file the claim, and so that's kind of my approach and the way I'm looking at this.
Yeah. And, there's precedent already in the CARES Act for this. We've been advising a lot of 501c3s on, the compliance side. The law allows you to apply for a PPP loan and an economic injury disaster loan, an EIDL loan, At the same time, it just says you cannot use the funds for the same expenses. So that's the whole idea behind, these programs. The PPP is more specific in terms of more limiting in terms of what you can spend it on. The idea is a little bit broader, but the whole idea is that you're spending on certain defined things. You just can't spend it on this things. And your idea for the tax credit certainly would work. By the way, we've had some people ask, well, we're tax exempt organizations, so how does this tax credit why does it matter to us? These are payroll taxes.
Yeah, payroll taxes.
And,
and they're refundable, so you can get cash. I mean, you could get, theoretically, for the first quarter, you're filing your payroll taxes right now. If you filed for ERTC, you'd get a refundable check right now, having not had to go through a bank to get that. It would just, and it needs to be more expansive. I get that. But it is a direct way to get businesses resources and those resources onto employees.
And hopefully, you'll be able to get that, restriction lifted about, no tax credit, refundable tax credit if you have a PPP loan. But if for some reason you're not, and you have to find some sort of a compromise, at least hopefully, what we don't want is C6 organizations to not take advantage of the tax credit right now because of fear of not later being eligible for a PPP. At least you could build some sort of a temporal, timing thing in where if you already took advantage of the tax credit, that's not going to make you prospectively ineligible for a PPP loan. Something along those lines. By the way, Mary Kate mentioned something earlier that's not the primary focus of today's program, but it's an important one. And that is for associations and other C6s that hold events, particularly larger events, or even not so much large in an objective standard, just large compared to their size. Significant revenues generated for their organization. There's been something that's been around for a long time called event cancellation insurance. It's been a focus of a lot of my work in recent months, recent weeks to try to help associations take advantage of that. Right now, going forward, just like happened after 9/11, you cannot get not only COVID-related claims, that's to be expected because it's no longer an unforeseen event. You cannot get any coverage in event cancellation insurance for any communicable diseases. You used to be able to purchase that coverage for about 20% more of the premium. You can no longer do that. The carriers have just completely run away from that. And that's part of what kind of the ASAE initiative is about. Again, this is not the most immediate focus right now, but going forward, that's an important part of kind of the economic structure, what makes associations work, and having the ability to have that insurance to cover these unexpected, unforeseen events and cover the downside. Something to just put on your radar screen going forward. It is a significant issue.
Yeah, it's something that's been discussed and that we're certainly thinking about, that we have to do post 9/11 with terrorist risk, and it is on the radar screen. That going forward, it'll have to be something that the federal government will likely have to backstop.
And that's what happened after 9/11, and it worked. And if you ever review these policies, you see that the terrorism endorsements, you can pay extra for, but it really, it needed that federal intervention, and it really worked. We're getting close to the end of the hour. Any closing remarks, or actually, Mary Kate, why don't I first ask you if you have any closing question or comments for Ami or Stephanie, and then let's turn it over to them and me.
We're just getting more questions about timing for the CARES 2 Act, or the next bit of aid that could expand the Paycheck Protection Program. Is it true that staffers and members of Congress are working on this now and unclear on exact timing?
Well, so I think there's two pieces. There's the $250 billion additional. Again, I'm hopeful that moves this week with some corrections of what we saw in CARES 1. And then I think all of us understand that we will need to do an additional bill. And I think it's being discussed right now what's in that bill, various, I'm certainly working on what national recovery strategy looks like. And I don't want to estimate on what the timing of that bill is, but I think, there's a real sense of urgency as well. But that one, I think you'll have a little bit more time, time being probably by the end of this month, I would hope that we have something. I don't know, Stephanie, do you want to?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. There's still a little bit of a game of chicken going on between the Senate and the House. at this point on the emergency package, because my understanding is that the Senate hasn't had any discussions, is unwilling to have discussions about improvements for the P3 loans. Rather, they are anticipating that the loans will run out and that political pressure will get them to where they need to be with the House. That, you know, when the money runs out, they'll be able to kind of say, I told you so, and get it moved forward with no changes, but just money. They seem to think that that if they address the state and local stuff and the healthcare workers, which, oh, by the way, is going to run out too, that they won't be able to get it through. They'd rather us take care of that in CARES 2. So we're still looking at a pretty intense game of chicken right now. I just don't see the House backing off on asking for not just fixes to P3 when you're going to add more money, especially when you're talking about $250 billion or $150 billion what they're asking. Or no, they're asking for $250 billion. When you're talking about that size of money, you know, I can't see us backing down from the request to make changes to a program that isn't being executed flawlessly. And then also, we gave $100 billion to the healthcare community, and I think 44 billion went out last week. Another 30-some billion goes out at the beginning of this week. They're about to run out too. So I just can't see. So anyways, intense game of chicken, but I can't see the House backing off. And unless the Senate is willing to negotiate and play ball, they're wasting precious time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any final minute or so closing remarks from Tom? You want to go first?
Sure. I would just say, you know, this is unprecedented. This pandemic is going to impact all of us in different ways, and we're all in this together, both as a country, but also as a world as well. And if we stick together, if we put the politics to the side and think about this as, you know, just the fact that we're in this together, we will come out of this stronger. I don't know what the new normal will look like, but I do know that we will be in a better place if we stick together and keep the politics out of this.
Thank you. Stephanie?
I'll just associate myself with what my colleague Ami Vera said. So
Always a
thank
good.
you so much for having us on.
Well, I want to thank you both on behalf of ASE and Susan, Mary Kate. I want to thank you guys very much for participating, and very importantly, even more importantly, for your kind of staunch, long-standing support of the association community. It's a community that I've kind of lived and breathed since I worked at ASE when I was going to law school at night, and am a deeply passionate member of that community. We really do appreciate your support. And I also want to thank, I see Susan's back with us, thank Susan and ASAE for organizing this and putting this really important forum together. Mary Kate or Susan, any closing remarks before we say goodbye?
If we can have a couple more minutes of a conversation. I know the members of Congress have to leave right now, but thank you guys so much for your time and your bipartisan message.
Thank you. We're very, very grateful to both of you. And Jeff, you know, you have so much expertise. If you can give us a couple more minutes, the questions are all coming up.
Yeah, so everyone else, if you want to stay on, we'll continue to answer questions and whatnot. But Stephanie,
thank you. Great.
So,
okay.
First off, thank you for everyone. I think we had over 500 people on today's town hall, so that's a great participation and terrific questions. We didn't even get to get to a fraction of them, unfortunately, but some great details, you know, stories to pass on. There was a lot of questions that were what I'll put in the bucket of Mary Kate, you and I've talked about this, like compliance related questions. You know, how to comply with these programs, you know, kind of more nuts and bolts things. And it's something that I think we ought to consider, as I mentioned to you, you know, having what today's forum was not for that, obviously.
Right.
But, you know, to have a separate forum like this, you know, to help people deal with these bigger picture compliance issues.
Yes, we've got one on the calendar on the 21st at I believe 12 p.m. and that will be on the ASA calendar shortly, and that will be we'll answer questions. There could be new CARES legislation by then or more progress, but we know that it's a lot of new programs and really complicated for a lot of associations. So we're going to work to get more of that. And for folks, the ASA resources page on Collaborate is great, or pardon me, on the website, but also executive management on Collaborate. Jeff has been answering so many questions.
Yes. Yeah, and Jeff, I agree with you. There are a lot of questions here about compliance issues, but I think the nice thing about what I'm seeing on both the Q&A as well as the chat is a lot of stories are coming forward that we can use to forward to not just the two congresswomen and congressmen that were with us today, but others. There's just a lot about what is the loss of intellectual development and knowledge development and developments in science if we can't have these meetings. I think that the direct cost to associations is one thing, and we see that clearly, but the cost to society is also another thing that I'm seeing in these comments that really loom large over the whole issue, and that is that we're not going to advance some things that we could, either at the local, state, or international levels. And so that loss is maybe not a direct economic one, for example, a loss to my revenue of X%, but it is a loss to what the contributions and the fulfillment of the mission of associations could be. So we're seeing a lot of those kinds of comments that we can roll up to create that kind of picture too, which is very helpful.
Yeah, no question about it. And look, as we all know, we live and breathe this stuff. You know, the economic impact of not being able to have in-person gatherings, in-person meetings, conferences, events, it's not only an impact on the association itself and their revenues and their employees, but it's an impact on the cities and towns and communities where these meetings are held. Massive economic impact. Yeah. And everything that I'm seeing, you know, because I come at this from the legal side, helping advise on potential cancellations and rebookings and everything else, you get to hear a lot of kind of the real thinking and what people are hearing from the members and whatnot. And this is scary stuff. You know, even after a lot of these, hopefully not if, but when, you know, a lot of these state and local bans on mass gatherings and stay at home and things like that are lifted, you know, what we're hearing across the board is that people are going to be scared to travel. They're going to be scared to be in large gatherings for quite a long period of time. And that has really scary implications for the association community, you know, for the travel and tourism community. And we need to try to find ways to address this and kind of view it as bridging that gap, that at some point, you know, hopefully, you know, all of the wonderful in-person meetings and events conferences that we all love will kind of be back in business. But who knows when that is, and we need to figure out how to get from now to then.
You're exactly right. And, you know, the associations are such a lag indicator. And here's a good example of that. You know, once the public health issue is addressed and we either have a vaccine or we have a way of containing, or, as was said earlier, making this at the local or community level where there are some of these shutdowns that we're seeing, that beyond that, you know, what we're seeing in terms of a recovery for associations and the community that we work with hospitality, hotels, DMOs, everybody's affected by this, is going to be much longer. And that's because of the public's appetite to travel, as well as to meet in large groups. And that's something that we really can't control. And we have to see unfold. You know, whatever we do in the way of outreach, whatever we do in the way of marketing our events, those are all things that we're just on a real slender thread here to figure out what's appropriate and when. And there's no real definitive date in sight for that past the time that the public health issue is lessened. So we're in it for, I think, a longer haul. You're right, Jeff.
I think there is a lot that we ASAE can do, for instance. You know, like I've been asked a lot, you know, from a liability perspective, okay, say we're rebooking our meeting from the summer to the fall. That's, you know, if we even feel, most associations, frankly, don't even feel comfortable doing that. Some are doing that, but building in protections, you know, like much lower attrition penalties and whatnot, and guarantees in the event that they can't do it, or they do it, but they have far fewer attendees. But then I get the question, well, how do we make it safe for our attendees and frankly for the association? You know, isn't there going to be great risk to us? What if, until there's a vaccine, we know this is going to be around. There is going to be risk of people contracting the virus at association conferences. I mean, it's happened already in the past, and there's a chance it will happen in the future. I think there is a role for ASAE to set some standards. Standard setting is part of what associations do. Guidelines for safe meetings. Pulling, of course, off of what the CDC puts out and whatnot. They already have some existing guidance on large gatherings and how to do it safely. But really helping ASAE's members figure out, okay, when we are back in business with these in-person meetings, here's some suggestions of things that you can do to help make it a safe environment for your staff, for your members, to encourage people to participate. That's just one example, but I think ASAE should play a leadership role in that regard.
I agree, and we intend to do that. I think what will be interesting to see unfold is how those guidelines might vary by region or by facility, how much the government gets involved with that, or health organizations such as CDC or WHO. And I think it's a global thing that we have to look at, because one country to another, these regulations or guidelines might vary. The one thing I will say, and I think the conversation that's going on in our industry broadly, is how that's going to change what we can expect in terms of the size and scope of these meetings. Because what was space before COVID-19 and is space after COVID-19 could look very, very different. But I assure you we'll take an active role in trying to aggregate that and give associations some clear guidelines so that they can plan. I think one of the things that's really challenging for associations right now is we know how we're being impacted in the here and now. We know what's happening to our budgets. We know what's happening to just the things that we're used to doing. I think was well said throughout these comments today. But what we don't know is how to plan with any kind of assurance for the future. The most we can do is to create scenarios, the what ifs of various things, and how that might look as we present these things to our boards. Because ultimately, we have to sit down and say, these are the most reliable scenarios or most likely scenarios that we can have, and they all have economic consequences. There's no such thing that I know of that's break-even upside right now. So how do we get to that point? I don't know, but how do we get to the real right now? I don't know either. But the reason I bring that up is not to sound terribly negative, although it's hard not to in this scenario, is to say ASAE will take an active role in trying to solicit that information, distill it, and make it useful to our members. So that's what we're here for.
Yeah, Mary Kay, thank you for sharing. I saw you just shared kind of a link to where people, if they want to get involved in these advocacy efforts, how they can sign on. I know a lot of people were asking that. I think another role that ASAE can help play, and maybe right now is not the perfect time for it, but there's a level of tension that I've never seen before between the association community and the hotel and convention center community, which has always been kind of one big happy family, right? We all love the hotel and convention center people. We all go to their events at the conferences and everything else. And right now there's a level of tension because everyone has economic risk. Everyone has economic loss. And, we're, as the association community, very sympathetic to the hotel and convention center community about the economic loss they're dealing with. They're playing hardball in negotiations the same way associations are. And I'm, as an association lawyer, kind of right in the middle of that on behalf of the associations. It's really difficult times. And I'm not saying that ASAE should ever get involved in individual negotiations or whatnot, but in terms of helping to rebridge that gap and kind of bring the community back together and find that common ground that has served both sides so well in the past, I do think that's going to be an important role. There's a lot of association execs right now that are very soured on the hotel industry and convention centers and some of the big meeting vendors and others, because it's been such a really ugly, difficult dispute over some of these contractual battles and whatnot. And anyway, I just throw that out there. It's probably something that's unspoken, but most people realize, and I think there is an important role. ASAE has always brought all of those sides together very, very well, and I think it's going to be an important thing to do in the future too.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jeff, because you're absolutely right. I think all of our hopes, we're members of a number of coalitions, Meeting Me Business. We're involved in as much in hospitality and travel as we are other areas of our industry partner community that support associations, and everybody's hurting. But you're right, these things can be, they're visceral, really, because in some cases, you have to make a decision that's pretty late in the game because of insurance and other factors that you want to let play out, so that if you have an advantage to have your insurance triggered, you can't make your decision months out. You just can't. And you're right that everyone's being hurt. This is a hopeful statement, but because we all need meetings, we all need to recover, and we all need to do that together, I hope we can find that common ground. I hope that we can lead the industry back to health in such a way that everybody prospers. And that sounds like blue sky and little bluebirds right now, and it is. But that's what we have to do. You know, all boats will rise when the time is right. We just have to make sure that we stay respectful. And I've heard it said a lot, and I believe it's true. Sometimes compassion gets put aside and understanding gets put aside. But I think it is important in our environment to remember those things as we deal with each other as individuals, and as we deal with each other as entities, as corporations and associations. I think that's just an important way for us to look at this point in time. And I was struck by our panelists, and again, thank you for bringing them to the table, and Mary Kate for the great questions. You know, they're putting the public health at the forefront, and I think that at the end of the day, that's what we need to do, and then we'll figure out the rest of this. The sad part of it is that I'm not sure how long some organizations can sustain this pain financially. I mean, that's the reality of it. You know, some organizations are better prepared than others, and it doesn't mean that one mission isn't more important than another, but we're going to have to look at a way to address the gaps. You know, if we have brothers and sisters out there who are struggling financially and they're not going to make it, we've got to be considerate of our sectors and say, gee, you know, how can we make that as important as a part of our mission? I think we'll see some mergers and acquisitions. I think we'll see some combining of interests. We'll see some things from a business standpoint that we haven't seen spike in a while, and they might, just so that associations can stay true to their missions and do the important work that they do. And that's not just in the US, I think that's across the world. So that's not a happy thing to say, but back to your point, Jeff, you know, it said we're in it together, and I'm not sure how much, you know, how much real solace there is in that, but it's true. And when we come out on the other side of it, it'll be true again. And that's all I can say, in good faith.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear you say that. And by the way, one of the points you made was that, you know, this decision to kind of wait to cancel is sometimes driven by the insurance coverage considerations. It is, but it's equally driven by, you know, this provision in contracts called force majeure, which is never focused on it. Now everyone knows what a force majeure clause is. I never thought I would spend so many countless hours analyzing and talking about and giving webinars about force majeure. But the you know, the analysis under a force majeure clause and whether an association can cancel a meeting without penalty is largely the same analysis that comes into play as to whether, if you have event cancellation coverage, it doesn't exclude communicable diseases, whether that's going to be in place too. And I think that's actually, Mary Kate, the program you're talking about, one of your colleagues was reaching out to me this morning for some questions about it. Is that the one about kind of cancel or postpone?
The Pandemic Risk Insurance Act is and it would be all prospective events.
The same program, but I know ASE is working on a program. It may not have even been announced yet, you know, about do we cancel or postpone? I think it's a different one, and it's going to have, you know, a bunch of association CEOs, I believe, kind of talking about this. And these, I'm really happy to, and I was given some suggestions about some potential panelists, because I think it's a really important program. This is what literally day in and day out, I'm on the phone with staff, with executive committees, boards, talking about these issues. You know, it's not the meetings that are coming up in early May. You know, now those are kind of the easier ones, right? To decide what to do. No one is going to have an in-person meeting in early May. It's just not going to happen, no matter what part of the country you are. But when your meeting is in, you know, mid-July or August or September, that's when the real, and obviously ASE, there was a question here, what are we doing about the annual meeting? And I'm sure I know no decisions have been made yet. And that's kind of the advice that I've been giving to so many of my clients who have meetings. Then ideally you want to wait until we get closer, because none of these governmental bans are really going to apply right now to a meeting in August to allow you to cancel without penalty. So there's risk in terms of cancellation penalties. But if you wait too long, there's like this window, both for force majeure cancellation and insurance, that you want to get within the window. The beginning of the window is when you believe you can cancel without penalty, and then the end of the window is likely when those governmental bans get lifted, and it's harder to make that argument that you're canceling because it's impossible or illegal for you to hold the meeting. And these are really difficult decisions. So I'm glad to see that ASE is putting together a program on that, because that's like
I've got more information on that. It's on Friday. It's a CEO dialogue, and details will be on the website shortly. And that's that website that Reggie shared, the ASAE resources page on coronavirus.
Great.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm glad you said that, because it's a delicate balance, and I'll just cut my remarks because I know we've gone way over. But one of the things that hangs in the balance of what you just said is members' understanding as to why you might run it down to the deadline that you've got to, in order to know if your insurance will actually be triggered by a closure that is out of your control, which is within the force majeure bandwidth. And a lot of people want to make a decision before then. So there's tension around that is hard to explain to members. The other thing that we are looking at, being ASAE, is that there's some really hard business decisions. Take your mission hat off for a minute, put your business hat on. And we've got to talk about short-term loans versus going into reserves. We need to talk about lease and real estate negotiations. So those are things that are underway as well. I would see in the future, and I've had some advice from our members, that we need to talk about, what things like Chapter 7 versus Chapter 11. I mean, there's some hard business realities that we're going to need to talk about coming up, and we will do that. Because, again, when you take your mission hat off, you've got to put your business hat on, and a lot of us are in that situation, or will be in the short term. So, thank you, Jeff, for bringing that dimension to our discussion, because that's our reality.
No,
That will be one of the weekly CEO dialogues that ASAE is planning.
Yeah, that's terrific. And all of these things seem to get magnified for the smaller associations. And I work with all different sizes. The smaller ones tend to not have as significant reserves, just as a percentage of of annual revenues and whatnot. And so they have a tighter leash economically, and they're really, really struggling with how to deal with these things. And you're right. Like back, remember in the 2008 recession, we saw a lot of association mergers and other combinations because there was this economic strain that was causing organizations to have to come together, especially if you have two groups that are kind of competing or playing in the same space. I do expect that we're going to see that, and that's another area where ASE has and can continue to provide leadership, in putting on virtual programs, webinars like this, to give folks all the different ideas that you just mentioned, right? Different economic options, some of it through the CARES Act, but some of it just generally.
That's it, just generally, exactly.
Versus, EIDL loans versus maybe PPP, bankruptcy versus other options, and which type, all of those, merger, dissolution, all of those things are options to deal with a crisis, and helping educate members as to what those options are. Like I usually say, pros and cons and considerations of those different options. It's really important. And, your publication staff does a great job in articles through Associations Now and other things, to put those things out there as well.
Jeff, thank you so much for joining us, for providing so much intel. And for all the people on the phone, we're still going to hit this hard on the Hill, because we have to keep making noise so that they don't forget about us. It's really a sustained effort that will be required to get associations included in the Paycheck Protection Program. So we've got more resources to share, but thank you so much. And Susan, any comments?
No, thank you, Mary Kate. That was a beautiful summary. Sign on to everything we send. Let's get our grassroots going. And as Mary Kate said, we'll fight this every way we can. And Jeff, thank you so much for your expertise. It is so needed in this climate. I can't begin to thank you enough.
My pleasure. And I do want to, kind of somewhat a personal note, in that there's a friend of ours in the association community who's on the hospital right now, really struggling, Ed Delarry, in fairly serious condition in Washington, D.C., former longtime editor of Association Friends, and kind of a friend to many of us. And I wanted to just take a moment to send our thoughts and prayers and best wishes to Ed and his family in this really difficult.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. It's good to know. Mary Kate?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And for more resources, check out the ASAE Coronavirus Roundup page and thepowerofa.org. And thanks, the Power of A and your support of that fund really makes all of our advocacy work possible. So thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Take good care. Stay safe and healthy.